So a major emergency meeting just took place with NATO members. However, the one who pays the most, America, was not there. Wasn't really invited. You won't believe what transpired out of that meeting. And there was a geopolitical analyst, an expert when it comes to the field of war. He says the reason Zelensky does not want peace is because he needs war. And he said he needs war just like Europe needs war. We'll talk about why he said that and why they're looking at the Third World War. And he said this will take place, especially if you allow Europe to be in the forefront. Our only hope is America pull out of NATO, because NATO loses power, Europe loses power when America is not funding what they're wanting. We'll talk about all that today. Also, we'll discuss our food system. I make mention of it because it's probably the most important thing to me, is making sure that we're feeding our families good quality food. Well, there's new lab milk, and now we're importing eggs, all because our leaders just decided to murder a lot of chicken. Let's talk about where we go from here and why it's important to make sure that we see that the problem is not the flu. I mean, it's not it. The problem is if they can control the food, then they control you. Let's dive in. Hey guys, welcome to the Max. Thank you so very much for being here today. We hope that you enjoy this video. If you do, please, we humbly ask that you give us a thumbs up. That means the world to us, and that tells this algorithm that this video is important. Subscribe and ring the bell. Again, those things help us. We have been held down tremendously through the first of the year, all because sometimes when we speak truth, people don't like it. So please make sure that you are subscribed to the channel and give us a thumbs up if you like it. Comment below. Tell us what you think about what we're talking about today. There's a lot of hot opinions yesterday when it comes to NATO, but our view is to pull out of NATO. That's my view, and I'll tell you why. This is from Martin Armstrong. He warns that Europe is falling. That's why they need war with Russia. You know, I'm 37, and I said this yesterday on Twitter. Help me understand. You know, so I was basically born kind of at the end of the Cold War. Help me understand why we always look at Russia as the enemy. Now, I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying they're good people. Just hear me out. That's all I've heard for most of my life. All the while, we have intel agents from China stealing our goods. There was a new story that CIA, all those ones that were fired, all those disgruntled people that were leaving the office, that were analysts that had top secret clearance. There's a story about how China is trying to basically give them whatever they want to know the secrets of the U.S. So we hear stories like that. We see that Iran says death to America. We see all these countries that despise us, Maduro and Venezuela, and we see all these countries that are just throwing rocks at us, throwing shade at us. And remember, Putin was almost a part of NATO. Remember, during the Clinton years, he was almost a part of NATO. We had trade with them. So help me understand why we want to make them the enemy. Well, this is where Martin Armstrong comes in. He says the reason they've got to be the enemy is because UK and Europe is fallen. They cannot make it and survive the way they've had mass immigration issues, the way that their budgets are falling to pieces and their dollars are falling to pieces, or their currencies are falling to pieces. He says they actually need this to stay relevant. Without this, there is no relevance. He goes on and says, you may have seen the heated exchange between President Trump and President Zelensky. He said what it is Zelensky does not want peace. He knows his best interest, and the only way that he probably will stay alive is that he stays relevant with Ukraine. Now, you heard the last few days that he's talked about how he could resign and as long as he's part of NATO. Well, what he's doing in saying this, remember, this man has been a dictator. I think his play, I might be wrong, this is just my personal opinion. I think his play is, if I promote peace, then I look like the winner. I can resign as the best president Ukraine ever had, and they develop peace under us, and now they're part of NATO, which means they're safe, and therefore I can go and live in America or live in one of my big mansions that I built during all this time. And we're talking about this actor who knew nothing about politics and now is a almost billionaire that has houses in Miami, I think in California, and probably all over the world. So I think that's why you're hearing him say step down. And here's why. I think you're hearing him say that because he knows if he, quote unquote, makes peace, which is all falsities, but if he makes peace, then he knows he probably won't be killed. But he knows, honestly, if Trump does peace with Russia without NATO, without Zelensky, I think it shows how much of a puppet he really was and how his life may be at risk. Unless he gets exiled and unless America takes him in or Britain takes him in or something like that. I mean, prime example this week. He came to Washington to get a mineral deal, to make billions of dollars. He left there because he was a little puppet and he showed his face, and what it came out was that he'd been meeting with Democrat operatives from the Obama and Biden White House, and then he kind of blew his chances there. So he leaves not gaining any money on a military jet going back to UK to get $2.7 billion. I said this yesterday, if you look at the interview with Starmer and Zelensky, it looks like they're sitting in like a Motel 6 lobby. UK has lost all its class and lost all its power. I mean, again, $2.7 billion is a lot of money, and he just signed a 100-deal agreement with Ukraine like that matters. I mean, it means nothing. But what is $2 to $3 billion when he's needing $200 to $300 billion? And here's what blows my mind. Macron and Starmer, and if I was part of Europe, if you're watching me from Europe, you better figure out something about your leadership. Because what just took place was they said that they are going to put boots on the ground and put planes in the sky, and that's how they're going to promote peace. Now, wait. Let's scratch that now. We're going to promote peace by bombing the flipping goodness out of another area. We're going to promote peace by putting boots on the ground and causing more war. Does that make sense to you? That sounds like Bush, Karl Rove, John Bolton. It sounds like the old way of even the United States. So this is what we do with NATO. This is why we have to get out. Because remember, we're obligated to help NATO countries. Well, if all of a sudden they throw a rock at a window and break a window, and then all of a sudden the owner of that house comes out and starts whooping up on the kids, guess what? It obligates us to go over there and try to save them. Well, that's exactly what they're going to do. I mean, Russia is a nuclear power that has one of the biggest strategic locations ever, has a huge army, no matter what's going on with this war. Why would we want to poke the bear? I don't get this. And Starmer, Macron, and all them, what they're realizing is all their countries are falling, flipping to pieces. And this global push that they're wanting NATO to gain power. They're wanting to be relevant again. So they need the war. So what they're saying is we're going to give all their tax bases, all their money from their citizens, and also their young kids, because it's constriction. They're going to make them serve. And they're going to go fight World War III with a nuclear threat. That just, to me, when you think about that, you're like, what makes sense about that? Nothing. But remember, if we're part of NATO, what's going to happen is they're going to put us in that. Well, let's go back to the emergency meeting that just took place. Now, what's so amazing is they had Zelensky sitting there, and they got a picture of all this photo of all these leaders, all these European leaders who are just, they look completely and utterly weak, sitting there like they're all in a game plan trying to figure out what the next step is, knowing full and well none of them can do jack diddly squat without the U.S. and the U.S. aid, the money. Listen to this. It says, NATO meeting without the U.S. discusses Ukraine security. Remember, Ukraine is not a NATO country. Ukraine has not had a free election since this has started, okay? Ukraine has been known as the laundering capital of the world. And all the EU is meeting to try to figure out how to go to war. It's unbelievable. Following recent geopolitical shifts, NATO members, excluding the United States, have convened with an emergency meeting to discuss the security strategies of Ukraine against Russia. It says the gathering comes as the statements by former President Trump indicated that the reduced U.S. involvement in NATO. Discussions have surfaced regarding the potential implications of NATO actions with the U.S. participation in alliance, meaning if America politicians and public figures pull out of NATO, NATO will probably cease to have any power. So they're trying to figure out how do we go from here? I love what this says. It says Zelensky admits that the Ukraine gets NATO membership if he fulfills his mission by stepping down. What he's trying to do is secure his future. He's a narcissistic, selfish guy who wants to make millions and billions of dollars. And he knows the only way that he is safe is if they get him in NATO, America backs NATO, and peace happens, and so therefore he can live happily ever after in one of his mansions. But he knows, unless war takes place and NATO somehow wins, he's okay. The problem, though, is this. If Trump and Russia develop peace treaties and stop this war, he knows how much of a puppet he was, and I believe he knows his life will be threatened. President Trump came out and said, we should spend less time worrying about Putin and more time worrying about the migrant gang rapes, drug lords, murders from the mental institutions that we're allowing enter your country in Europe. See, that's why they have to stay relevant. They know their countries are literally falling to pieces. And they know if they keep going at this trajectory, there will be no France as we know it. There will be no UK as they know it. There will be no Germany as they know it, or whatever country you want to name there, because they've allowed for their borders to be open, even worse than America, to a point where now they're almost overrun. And Trump, I thought, I mean, again, sometimes he says stuff and you're like, gosh, why'd you say that? I mean, there's times he kind of does stick, I mean, he kind of says something that's just kind of out there. He calls it the weave, but really it's just, sometimes it's just a little out there. But I thought this was one of the best points, was when he said, quit worrying about Putin and start worrying about your own European Union, your own country. It's falling to pieces around you. It's falling to pieces around you, and you're worried about another person. You're worried about another place. You're worried about something you shouldn't be worried about, especially when Putin has already said he would want peace. There's a word saying that there's back channels talking about how part of the peace deal would be to open the Nord Stream pipeline back again. The number 2 that was quote unquote blown up that nobody knows about, which Biden pretty much probably knew about. But what he's saying is, if they do peace, then everybody can get their oil again. Guess what? The sad thing is, Germany and Europe, all those places, they've been getting the oil from Russia the whole time. So you tell me how that makes even sense, is that they're wanting to go to war with the person who's actually keeping them heated, and wanting to go to war with the person who's actually helping them make sure that they can be taken care of and not die of cold weather. Also, the fertilizers. There's a new story that came out that said Russia is providing fertilizers to all of Europe still so they can grow food. So their food and energy is coming from Russia while they're trying to fight Russia. So what it looks like is Ukraine's just a laundering money hole, or there's some other global push of a play that make them relevant again. It just doesn't make sense. You ever heard of biting the hand that feeds them? That's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're literally trying to be warm and eat food, and both of those things are coming from majority of Russia. Now, Trump has told them, look, I'm going to tariff you if you don't start buying it from me anyway. But he said, this is the prime example of what are you doing? You're literally trying to go to war and put boots on the ground and see your bloodshed, see your men die, all in the name of what? Ukraine? No offense to Ukrainians here, but I bet you before 2014, I'd say, people couldn't even tell you where Ukraine even was or what it was. They probably thought it was part of Russia. Definitely before, even probably before 2020, most people couldn't tell you about Ukraine. I mean, think about it. How long have you known the Zelensky name? Go back in his history and actually see. He speaks fluent Russian. He was Russia. He was not Ukrainian. They had to teach him how to speak Ukrainian. So don't give me that. So we tend to forget that news really does propagandize us and really does push us to a certain narrative to believe that, Russia's a bad player and that Ukraine is good. They're probably both bad players, and we just need to stay out of their business and let them do their regional war and be done with it. Same with any other place. I mean, look, we hadn't really talked about Azerbaijan and that area. I mean, they're in conflict and war all the time. Africa's in conflict and war all the time between regional areas, and we don't talk about them. The reason is because there's a special interest, and it's called laundering funds when it comes to Ukraine. Finally, America's starting to wake up to it. Well, at least Trump and the conservatives are starting to wake up to it, not necessarily the Democrats. But prime example of why we have to pull out of NATO is the fact that if NATO goes to war, which without our money they can't, but if NATO goes to war, we're obligated to go to war with them. I mean, you hear this week, just because Zelensky acted like a complete and utter fool in front of cameras in our country, in our people's house, in our leadership's house of the America, really of the world, and disrespected our two leaders. Now all these people in Europe are trying to reprimand us? That makes no sense, does it? They're trying to stay relevant. Another sign of reprieve, there was a story done. Again, this is another story that just shows the kind of problems we're in America and how bad our financial problems are and how they're trying to cut, like NATO spending, like I was telling you yesterday, like $8.4 trillion has been spent over the last decade on NATO spending. I mean, we have no money. We can't do that. Well, Trump came out and also said he's going to cut some of the UN funding. There's a new report that says United Nations chief warns the global funding crisis due to U.S. cuts. Remember, the UN, NATO, USAID, WHO, these places cannot make it without our funding. And then we give them the power over us to set policy and precedent. That global push has got to stop. Just like this, it says that the UN cannot fund its NGOs without the money of America. Why does America have to pay for everybody to work, to do things? So it shows that the taxpayers, not only are you funding your local government and your city and state and county governments through your property tax, which is complete stealing from you, you're funding through income tax federal government who is giving money across the world. So do I want to help people all over the world eat? Yes. But the problem is, a lot of this is NGOs. There's a story like, for instance, what George Soros does is he starts a nonprofit to work for the government. He's not really using his cash. What he does is just gets it started. And because of his influence, he allows the NGOs and the money funneled from the government to funnel into those nonprofits. And ultimately, that's how he sets policy and precedent all over the world. He doesn't need his money. He uses the NGOs, UN, USAID, and all these other NGO companies to basically fund what he wants to do. So what we've seen is America has been taken advantage of for far too long. I have an idea. Why don't we pull out of UN, just like we did the WHO? Why don't we pull out of NATO? Why don't we pull out of every free trade and every agreement and renegotiate every bit of it? Why don't we renegotiate every amount of money going across the world? Because guess what? They're all going to be begging at our feet because they all know they cannot make it without the American taxpayer. Instead of coming and dogging us out and talking about how bad we are, what we should do is cut them all off. Every flippin' country, every flippin' quote-unquote ally, and make them come grovel at our feet. Because we have no money. To me, there should be a balanced budget initiative and a plan to have a surplus of money before we're able to give any money out. There should be no more lobbying funds, term limits, and no more money given to foreign aid whatsoever. Not an ounce. If you want to buy something from us, great. If you want to get a loan, great. Then if you don't pay it back, we own your country. That's how business works. What are we doing? Grants? Giving money to NGOs to turn around and filter to really hurt us? What Soros is doing? Makes no sense, does it? Now, last story I want to talk about. Eggs and milk. There's a new story that came out that said that now they're making lab-grown milk. You don't even need the cow anymore. So we've got lab-grown meat. We've got lab-grown milk. We've got all this quote-unquote fake milk, soy milk, almond milk. What's the point in the cow anymore? Well, guess what? Chickens, I mean, we have no eggs. So there was a story done that Trump administration is having to import eggs, millions of eggs from tons of suppliers across the world. Now, what's in these eggs? What kind of eggs are they coming from? Are they farm fresh? You don't know. You know nothing. Well, last administration killed like 50 to 70 million birds. Now we're seeing the implications and the impact of what, quote unquote, the bird flu had on us. Had nothing to do with the bird flu. Had everything to do with control. And this goes back to RFK. You want to set policy and change things, the USDA and the FDA should be shut down. Should be completely shut down. You know, the labeling, the organic labels, and all this, you know, non-GMO and all that, that's great. And if I'm buying food, I do try to look for those labels. But what you need to pay attention to is, remember, those labels mean nothing if you're buying food from overseas. Did you know that? If it says made in China, made in Taiwan, raised in, you know, Barbados, wherever, it doesn't matter. If it's not in America, they actually do not have to have our labels and actually adhere to our guidance. So when you get organic fruit from Mexico, that means nothing. When you get organic fruit from Taiwan, that means nothing. So we need to understand that our food system is broke. It only benefits the bigger players. Why do you think people want to take over the milk and chicken? Well, it's the same way with our money. It's the same way with the eggs. If they can control it, if they control your money and they control your food and they control your energy, then they control you. I feel like I always say this, but it's so true because I really want to promote the fact of sustainability. If you can't grow your own food, okay, I understand that. But you can source it. Every town, even the smallest towns, have some kind of farmer's market. And I promise you, you know someone who has some backyard chickens. Right now, I mean, prime example, our egg production has went up about 80% here on our property. Why? Because it's springtime. So this is your perfect time to get eggs from a farmer, and not only get it from a farmer, look at water glassing them. Look at putting them up, dehydrating, freeze-drying, so you are not controlled by the biggest players in the game. Milk. Milk is one of the most dangerous things they say when it comes to labeling. I've told you before, I milk cows every morning. Every morning at 4 a.m. I milk cows. Those cows need to be milked, and that milk is only good for about 5 to 7 days in its raw form. Now, it's still good, but it just has it tastes like the pasture, tastes like the cow. It's just not as good quality after about the 5th to 7th day, depending on what they're eating, their diets. Now, does that make my milk worse than what you're buying at the store? No, it actually makes it what it actually is. It is milk. But if we want milk to last a month, 2 months, 3 months, well, if we want to cut the carbon out because the cow is dirty and nasty, we don't need the cow anymore, we need lab-grown milk that lasts a year. That's quote-unquote innovation, and USDA and FDA has allowed those things to happen right in front of you. And all this stuff, all this fake food, is making us more sick and more dependent on them to provide it for us. The war on farmers is bigger than ever. Look at UK. I mean, look at all of Europe. They're destroying their farmers. And we're getting close to it here unless we see a resurgence of regenerative farming and sustainable practices. Do not miss out on what they're doing when they're taking away the chicken, the egg, and the cow. Those things are so vital to what we eat and our food, our protein, good quality diets. And if they can manipulate and take those things away, what do you have? More boxed dinners from Walmart? The bird flu has nothing to do with the egg. The bird flu has nothing to do with some kind of flu that they need to eradicate. It has everything to do with controlling the egg, with controlling the chicken, the two most cheapest economical proteins there are. Milk. Milk is part of everyday life. We use it to cook. We use it to do everything. We drink it. It's a part of our life. Again, another economic, cheap way to keep us strong and healthy. Well, now they're over it too. The more regulatory bodies and problems we have to cause for the local farmer to go out, the more you will be controlled by big players. And this is scary. And here's why. Even though our administration may be doing good, there's still players of the bureaucratic ways, such as the USDA and FDA. You know, so when we're pulling out of UN, we're pulling out of NATO, that's all great. But we also need to come back home and say, you know what? It keeps us now focused on what we're doing at home, and we realize a lot of these people are taking advantage of us. And do we really need regulation? I mean, like if I sold eggs at a farmer's market, I have to get all my chickens checked by a state government to come in and make sure all my chickens are quote-unquote healthy. It's amazing why we would put ourselves through that and we consider ourselves a free country. Now, I'll just sell them anyway. But I mean, what I'm saying is if I go take them to a quote-unquote farmer's market, there's regulatory bodies that says I can't unless I get a license, a tax on me, and they get to inspect my home, the chicken coops, and the chicken. Why are we allowing this to take place? Makes no sense to me. So pay attention. We need to get out of NATO because it's going to put us in World War III. We need to get out of the UN so we quit spending money and really money that is spent on globalist push and not on America first. And then once we quit spending money there, we need to realize what's happening back at home. And I think Doge is doing a good job of that. If you didn't watch my video yesterday, you need to go back and watch it about how the threat on Elon and threat on Doge, literally like life threats, murder threats, all because they're wanting to clean up America's budget. Good things are happening, but I think there's a long road ahead of us and we need to be prepared for it. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on today's video. Are you worried about milk and eggs coming from overseas? Remember, all they have to do is stick to somewhat of our restrictive policies. They don't actually have to be organic. They don't actually have to be non-GMO. They don't have to adhere to our guidelines. It's very vague when it comes to the food system coming from overseas. Let me know your thoughts on all this. God bless.